In keeping with our way of looking at history, we'll try to understand early modern Japan and early modern China in terms of their place in the world, economic and political systems in the 17th and 18th century, and the changes they were undergoing before and during contact with the West, which is defined as contact with European traders and missionaries. The early modern is not so much a period in time as a developmental context. In connection with world history, this term is both useful and problematic. In simple terms, the early modern can be defined as a historical stage in which a society is becoming modern. In practice, it means that a society is modern in some ways while remaining pre-modern in other ways. The problem with this definition is that we have not yet defined what modern means except in terms of the West. One of our key questions this semester is why our modern world looks Western and how that came into existence. As a part of that question, we are also asking whether it is possible for non-Western societies to be modern without also becoming Western. This part of our conscious attempt to challenge the rise of the West narrative to see how much of it works in world history and how much of it we need to rethink. In this unit, we are coming face to face with that question. If we define the modern world with some very general characteristics and try to be aware of any Western ideas they contain, we can still create a definition that works. Remember, we're not rejecting the modernity of the West or of European contributions to the modern world. We are only trying to include the rest of the world in the narrative as well, since this is a world history course. Remember that the pre-modern world depended for nearly everything, all food products and thus all wealth, on farming. All farming was done using natural energy sources such as muscle power, animal power, and wind and water. Both muscle and animal power were dependent upon the growing of food. Since there were no chemical fertilizers, human and animal waste was the primary method of fertilizing soil. The productivity of the land was based on natural geographical advantages and the amount of waste produced by the people and animals that worked it. In other words, there were limits to how much could be grown, and that meant that there were limits on how many humans could live on the planet. Weather, disease, war, and poor harvests frequently led to major population changes. Population declines could lead to declines in the economy as a whole. Population increases could overstress political, economic, and trade systems easily and lead to population declines. All wealth, and so all taxation, was based on farming, mining, forestry, or gathering and hunting. So, the early modern has to do with societies approaching modernity. Dictionary.com defines modernity as the quality of being modern, or something that has the quality of being modern. Since these definitions are circular, that is, they define modernity using its root, modern, we really learn nothing from them that is useful to our inquiry. Instead, we need to think of a historical definition of modernity. I would say that this is a collection of ideas and social norms that historians use to quantify a particular state of social, cultural, economic, and political realities in relation to other states in a developmental model. In other words, modernity is comparative and is a method of placing societies within categories of historical development in order to create a historical period. Historians use historical periods, time spans that are characterized by general sets of historical trends, to break history into shorter periods that make it easier to comprehend change. Early modernity is a way to characterize societies which are transitioning into the state of modernity. If we define modernity as a situation in which states are defined as nation-states rather than empires or city-states, within which the state must be more or less responsible to the will of its people, where all people and the state are subject to the rule of law, and in which the economy has more or less escaped the limits of production related to the biological old regime, then we can define some societies as more or less modern, and those that appear to be in transition towards these standards of modernity as early modern. Japan in the 17th and 19th century was one such early modern society. Well, how does this all come about? We start with the beginning of the Tokugawa period in 1601. After his win at the Battle of Sekigahara in 1600, Tokugawa Ieyasu, the first of the Tokugawa line to be shogun, was able to consolidate power in a system historians now call centralized feudalism. And understanding this political system is important for understanding how Japan exhibited early modern characteristics in this period. First, Tokugawa Ieyasu and his successors ruled from the capital city they established at Edo, what is now called Tokyo. This was different from the emperor's capital city at Kyoto. The differences are significant, as is the transition from Kyoto to Edo itself. From its earliest times, Japan was organized as an empire. The capital city was moved to Kyoto in 784, and all political activity happened there until 1184. During this period, the territory ruled by the emperor expanded to include most of what we call Japan today. Using modified versions of Chinese law, writing, and political theory, the emperors of Japan claimed control of all land in Japan, and thus the right to receive tribute from all landholders in the form of taxes on the agricultural goods they produced. Like all pre-modern societies, Japan was thus agrarian, subject to the limits of the biological old regime, and organized like most agricultural societies. The emperor supported the activities of the government through these taxes. They paid for construction of the palaces and roads, the formation and training of the army, and the work of an elite group of administrators who became a class of aristocrats. As Japan's territory grew, it reorganized to take advantage of the expertise and defensive capabilities of wealthy large landowners in the countryside. In exchange for their work organizing private armies, which the emperor could call upon when he needed them, they were granted tax-free status. This reduced the emperor's tax revenue and increased his dependence on these local landholders for administrative and military needs. Eventually, by 1184, Japan began to break apart into small domains that were ruled exclusively by their landowners, whose service to the emperor led to a pejorative title, those who serve, samurai. This atomization of Japanese power, economic, political, and military, eventually led to a series of civil wars in which the local landowners fought each other for control of ever larger pieces of territory, making larger and larger alliances in the process. The culmination of this process was the victory of Tokugawa Ieyasu in 1600 at the Battle of Sekigahara, by defeating roughly half of Japan's samurai and controlling the other half through alliances. Ieyasu was able to make himself as powerful as the emperor. To maintain order, he did not attempt to overthrow the emperor, however. Instead, pretending to obey imperial wishes, he took control of the legal, military, and economic parts of Japan's society, and left the emperor in control only of the liaison between humans and the gods. Thus, Japan went from kingdom to empire to feudal system to civil war. However, Tokugawa Ieyasu was dealing with experienced and powerful warrior houses. He could not simply assume control. He faced several key problems in consolidating power. The best he and his successors could do was to keep the peace. In some ways, this is like Europe in that local military powers were all so equal in power and wealth that recreation of an empire became impossible. Ieyasu developed what we call centralized feudalism. The ideological, legal, and military and economic basis of this system is why we think of Japan as early modern from 1600 to 1868. It remained tied to the past in terms of political relationships and the basis of power and wealth, the biological old regime, but developed modern ideas to deal with new realities, including a legal system that increasingly applied to all, including the shogun, an economy that was more and more interconnected by a modern transportation system and modern methods of security and modern methods of foreign relations. Ideologically, during the Tokugawa shogunate, Japan underwent unprecedented change. We don't have the time or space to deal with all of these changes in this course. However, we will hit the main points. First, Tokugawa shoguns faced the problem that they had unified Japan through military force. In order to prevent a return to civil war, and more importantly, to provide for the successful and peaceful succession of future members of the Tokugawa clan to the shogun seat, they developed ideological ways to prove that they were the legitimate holders of the job. They accepted the office of shogun from the emperor. This was really just the office of head of Japan's military forces, and the Tokugawa were really already that because of their alliances with other samurai houses and their victory in 1600. The title allowed them to claim the office. Since they were descendants of the imperial line, they could also claim that they were the only legitimate holders of this title. Since they claimed the emperor was busy as the liaison between humans and the gods, they could also claim to have been delegated the responsibility of ruling humans so that the emperor could have the time to deal with heaven. In practice, this meant that the Tokugawa claimed the right to make and enforce laws, control the economy, and provide security for the entire Empire of Japan. However, because each local warlord had a private army, and those armies added together to make a larger force than the Tokugawa army, they had to be careful. So they agreed that each local landowner had control of all law, people, and the right of all taxes in his domain, or han in Japanese. The Tokugawa thus only controlled the large landowners, the daimyo, and not local people except in their own lands. They made laws by limiting castles to one per domain, giving the shogun the right to approve daimyo marriages, and requiring all daimyo to come to the capital city of Edo to attend the shogun for 6 months each year. But each local daimyo controlled his own farmers and samurai. This system is known as the Bakuhan system, or Bakufu, which means shogunate, and Han, which means domains. In order to further cement order and his own control, the Tokugawa implemented a version of Confucius' moral economy. In Confucius' version, society was divided into 4 key categories, not including the Chinese emperor. Confucian scholars were considered the most important members of society because they were its organizers, judges, and managers. Next on the list was farmers because they produced the goods. There is more evidence of the importance of the biological regime here. And food that China needed to survive and prosper. Craftspeople were third because they produced the homes and tools necessary for life and work. Last on the list was merchants, who were seen only as parasites who purchased farmers and craftspeople's goods and simply redistributed them for profit, thus, according to Confucian, contributing nothing to society. The Tokugawa adjusted this ideological system to fit Japan. Rather than scholars, they placed the samurai at the top of the social order. The second level of farmers, artisans, and merchants remained the same as in China, though. By creating this system, the Tokugawa emphasized the importance of the samurai in keeping order and reinforced the power of the daimyo, the top-level samurai, at the top of which were the Tokugawa themselves. This system also reinforced the importance of farmers in the biological regime. All goods came from the land, and so management of land-related issues was the key to the economy and thus to power. Since the farmers were the direct managers of the land and so the most important taxpayers, control of the farmers was one key to the system. By making farmers important, the Tokugawa were also better able to secure their cooperation with the system. The fact that the moral economy was a means of control based on pre-modern realities meant face-to-face with the results of this new organizational system, particularly beginning in the late 1600s. While farmers were second in the chain of importance, the high tax rates that farmers paid and high rents, since most farmers were renters, meant that farmers were generally very poor, though very important. Artisans, especially merchants, however, had a different reality. These people were mostly confined to the cities. Since the Tokugawa system was pre-modern in its understanding of the economy as based on agriculture, it taxed farmers heavily, but did not bother to learn how to effectively tax business. So urban-dwelling merchants and artisans based in cities with growing populations paid low taxes and saw their customer bases increase. In addition, the Tokugawa created other business-friendly reforms that enriched city dwellers. First, in order to make sure that their armies could go anywhere quickly and enforce the peace, the Tokugawa improved and maintained Japan's already extensive system of intercity roads. To control transit on those roads, especially to make sure that they stopped any military activity and caught any spies, they created way stations that were like the customs control points in airports today. As all travelers had to stop and be inspected, and as daimyo traveled every 6 months with large groups of soldiers, these way stations also led to the growth of villages and towns with inns where people could stay overnight and restaurants where they could get food. As these villages grew, so did the business that occurred with them. Aside from the transportation system, the Tokugawa taxed farmers in rice and other produce. rather than in money. This practice of taxing in kind rather than in cash was common in biological old regime societies worldwide, but in towns and cities, business was done using coins and eventually paper money. This was easier to carry than produce and easily convertible. It could be used to buy anything. So farmers paid tax to their daimyo in rice. The daimyo paid salaries to samurai in rice. Both daimyo and samurai needed cash to buy their goods in the towns. Thus a business of rice traders grew up, people who would buy rice for cash. This meant a need to find a fair price for rice that could be easily agreed upon. For that purpose, Japan developed a rice exchange based on what is today Osaka. This was essentially a commodities market, and it facilitated business nationwide by creating a price system that could be understood anywhere in Japan, thus supporting business. All this suggests a move toward the modern rule of law, centralized bureaucratic government rather than feudalism, and a centralized pseudo-capitalist economic system. The city of Edo was the best example of this growing urban culture. Edo was the largest city in the world in the 18th century. With 1 million people, Edo was twice as big as Europe's biggest city, London. There one could find a sophisticated interaction of business people, samurai, craftspeople, politicians, and religious experts who ran temples. In order to control population and residency, the Tokugawa also implemented an early modern census system. All Japanese were required to register their names at the local Buddhist temples at birth. The Buddhist temples took care of all religious activities, but the records were available for the government to use for legal and tax purposes as well. In this way, the Tokugawa were working with a population control system that was both modern and pre-modern. Looking at the vague circular target pattern in this view of Edo, you can see another of the Tokugawa early modern systems of social control. All castle towns, Edo was the main castle town, where the Tokugawa castle sat, all castle towns were required to have the daimyo's castle in the center. In order to make finding the soldiers easy for the Tokugawa forces, all samurai were then required to live within a short walk from the castle, near the center of town. All of this was protected in Edo by a series of moats. Outside the samurai castle central district was the merchant and artisan districts. You can see the merchant district here, shaded darker than the rest of the city. This arrangement of all castle towns improved the ability of daimyo and the Tokugawa shoguns to know who was where and what activity was permitted in what parts of the city. Strictly speaking, for example, merchants and artisans were not allowed in the samurai district unless on specific business. Likewise, samurai were not supposed to go into merchant or artisan areas without passes. These laws were enforced by the shogun's soldiers, and penalties for violating them ranged from very light to execution. The layout of the city thus emphasized social status and occupation. This is, again, a kind of early modern means of social control. Using geography and urban design, the Tokugawa separated people by class, allowing effective enforcement of laws and economic rules. However, the class system itself came from an earlier society and was based entirely on agrarian principles of social hierarchy related to the biological old regime. So we can see that in the period from 1600 to 1868, Japan under the Tokugawa shogunate was moving from a pre-modern system based entirely on the biological old regime to a set of ideas that included modern ones, despite continued dependence on the biological old regime. It is important to note that none of these modern ideas came from the West. They were indigenous to Japan, Japanese solutions to Japanese problems. This seems to answer our question in the case of one culture at least. It is possible to be modern and not be Western.